first point, trying to summarize what I've heard over the past few days, is that we've heard a number of interventions that make the important point that the Doctrine of Discovery was just one of a number of racist legal principles used by colonizing and dominating governments to justify the expropriation and theft of indigenous people's rights in their traditional lands, territories, and resources. In Australia and many parts of Africa, we've heard that the principle of terra nullius was applied. In the Philippines, for example, the Regalian Doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, and the like. Whatever the label, the intent was the same: to seize and claim sovereignty and control over indigenous lands, and then facilitate their transfer to the colonizing or dominating nation, and thus invest the entire settler population in the perpetuation of these doctrines. It's indisputable that all these principles were first of all accepted as part of international law, as defined by those colonizing and dominating nations, and secondly, were clearly based on racist and unscientific assumptions. I think that point has been made a number of times, and it's very important to remember that. This reality then explains the repeated and compelling calls that we've heard over the past 2 days from the United Nations General Assembly to take definitive action in denouncing all of these colonial-era racist doctrines. To make it absolutely clear that first, any and all of these doctrines are illegitimate and cannot be used by states today in dealing with claims of indigenous peoples to the full scope of their territories, lands, and resources based on their own indigenous law, custom, and tradition. I agree strongly that such action by the General Assembly is absolutely essential before we can move forward on this vital issue of land justice for indigenous peoples. I think such action, from what we've heard, is particularly important because of the legal position of most states that territorial sovereignty asserted under these racist principles is an established fact under the principle of intemporality. And we're sorry, we just can't do anything about it. The Constitution paper prepared by the Haudenosaunee American Indian Law Alliance provides, I think, an important discussion of this principle of colonial-era international law. That is, the principle that temporality says that the lawfulness of an action that must be determined according to the law existing at that time and not according to the law when a subsequent dispute arises. And of course, I think that begs the question of whose law. Is it the law of the colonizer that we look to when these acts happen, or we look to indigenous law? I think clearly indigenous peoples have made the point that their law at the time of colonization and domination did not take into account the Doctrine of Discovery. And it's this type of colonial mindset, I think, that is reflected throughout many of the approaches used by nation states today in the mechanisms that they've adopted in their efforts to resolve these claims through treaties and agreements. I cite specifically to Canada. We've heard a number of interventions by delegates from the common law countries, but I think Canada's comprehensive land claims process is typical of many of these failed approaches and is clearly violative of Articles 28 and 37. Canada, for example, negotiates treaties with the express proviso that these agreements are not to be intended to resolve so-called historical claims, but rather, quote, a political process as opposed to a rights-based process. Canada claims that these treaties are designed to assure certainty. Typically, that certainty is for Canada's own extractive industries, and we've seen this in other countries as well. By extinguishing, or Canada says modifying, Aboriginal title and rights claims to all but a tiny fraction of traditional lands. We are told these treaties need to be forward-looking agreements intended to provide a basis for indigenous and economic community development. In closing, I think the failure of these processes makes it clear for the need for some type of special mechanism. I was particularly intrigued by the proposal yesterday by the Sami for the end of the day about a need for a special mechanism under the UN auspices to investigate these land claims. And I think that type of special mechanism, obviously a lot of discussion would be needed on its scope of reference, its mandate, the type of expertise, and its investigative powers. But I think that type of special mechanism would certainly help in moving toward implementation of Articles 28 and 37. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, brothers and sisters. I don't wish to add much to what my colleague Robert Williams has said, except to make 2 or 3 points. The first of which was an astounding silence in the discussion by many of the states which have actually benefited from the doctrine of discovery. I think it is unfortunate that some of those beneficiary states chose not to participate in this debate, and one can only surmise that they presume that the legitimacy they claimed under the doctrine of discovery still holds, and they therefore don't need to discuss the issue. I think that is at least unfortunate and the worst of evasion of their responsibilities. The second point I'd like to make, Madam Chair, if I may, is in relation to the statement made by the Government of New Zealand, which was, with respect, blatantly dishonest. In their statement, the New Zealand government stated that the relationship between the Indigenous people of New Zealand and the New Zealand government is particular in that it is based on the Treaty of Waitangi. What they chose to ignore in their statement was that even while the treaty was in the process of being negotiated, the British government exercised the right of discovery over our land, not once, but twice. And it is remarkable to me that the New Zealand government has chosen to ignore in their statement that blatant exercise of the right of the doctrine of discovery. I would like to make 2 or 3 other brief comments, if I may, Madam Chair. The first is to reinforce the statement made by my colleague Robert that when we look at the validity or legitimacy of the doctrine of discovery and the notions of its contemporary effect, it would be helpful, I think, if we devote more time to considering legitimacy under whose law. Clearly, from the statements from Indigenous peoples, the doctrine of discovery held no legitimacy under Indigenous law at the time of its promulgation by various colonisers, and therefore holds no legitimacy now. And I support the suggestion made in some submissions and some interventions made by Indigenous peoples that there be a detailed study undertaken of the doctrine. And I would like to suggest that as part of that study, there be an investigation of how various Indigenous legal systems and philosophies actually regarded the application of the doctrine of discovery. The second point that I'd like to make was also raised in a number of interventions about the difficulty and unacceptability of the use of the term conquest. And I'd like to suggest that if the forum undertakes any study of the doctrine of discovery, that it also includes in that study the origins and use and continuing use of terms such as conquest, because to me they are all tied up with the whole ethos of the doctrine of discovery itself. Fourthly, may I just compliment all of the contributors to this debate for your forthright views, your courage and eloquence in expressing them. And may I close, Madam Chair, by saying that I received the unfortunate and disturbing news earlier that members of the Youth Caucus have been banned from attending future sessions of the forum, that some have had their identification badges removed permanently because of their participation in the silent and peaceful protest this morning. I would urge that the Secretariat and members of the forum take that up with the appropriate authorities. It is unacceptable that any of our young people should be banned from this forum simply for stating their rights. That seems to me to be, at best, a very colonising action on the part of this organisation. Thank you,